Bien, y estamos con uno de los principales disertantes en lo que es este tercer encuentro para médicos veterinarios que organiza la Cámara Argentina de Feedlot, el doctor Fluharty, y le vamos a preguntar algunos conceptos de lo que estuvo haciendo acá en Pilar, provincia de Buenos Aires, con casi 90 médicos veterinarios que estuvieron escuchándolo. Okay, Francis, what are you doing today here in Argentina, and which were the main topics that you were talking with Argentinian vets?
Okay, well, I was here talking about acidosis in feedlot cattle, and the main things that I were talking about were management ways to prevent acidosis, and the fact that I believe that we need to realize that when we're feeding these cattle high-grain diets, we're feeding a diet that is 4 times more energy dense and digestible when you combine them than a forage diet. And so one of the main things that we have to do is make sure that when we're feeding these very high energy grain diets, that we bring the cattle onto their diet very slowly over a period of about 2 weeks. And I control the intake of cattle. One of my main points is we called feed bunk management. And actually the system I use is what's called slick bunk management. And that just means that we only try to give a pen of cattle what they'll consume in 24 hours. And unlike dairy diets where you want to feed in excess and have feed always available, with these high grain diets, we want an animal and a pen of animals to be fed only amount that they'll clean up in 24 hours. And so we restrict our increases in intake to 5%. And we restrict our reductions in intake to 5% because we're just trying to create a very uniform intake because the bacteria that are in the rumen digest feed by attaching, and they create a lot of acids that the animal absorbs. And so my main point is that when we always have feed in the feed bunk, weather patterns greatly influence intake. But when we set the intake, the cattle learn to come to the feed bunk when a feed truck is delivered. It's a lot like when your parents call you to the dinner table, you learn to come. And so that's in essence the same thing that we're doing. So that results in a very consistent intake and reduces acidosis.
And what have to know Argentinian vets about how to control this problem in feedlots?
The very first thing that I would do is when you have a pen of cattle, just watch the cattle. It's really important to be there when the feed truck comes by, because as you watch a pen of cattle being fed, you can see where there is interest in feed or whether they're not interested. And we want the majority of cattle getting up and making their way to the bunk when the feed truck arrives. The other thing we look at is the manure in the pen. These high grain diets don't have a lot of fiber, but that doesn't mean that we accept watery manure or diarrhea. And so we look for watery manure as an indication of a digestive upset. And anyone who's a parent knows what I'm talking about. So that's one of the main things. The other thing is corn particle size. The most common thing I see worldwide in feedlots is that people think that you need to grind corn very fine. And that's actually very detrimental to the animal. And the research data would say that we really need very little grain processing when we're feeding less than 15% fiber. What we really want is we want to realize that when that animal swallows corn, it chews it first. And by chewing it, it breaks it apart. So by the time the corn makes it to the rumen, it's already finely ground in many cases.
And how can vets say this message to the farmers, but it's not so easy to the vets to translate this message?
It's very difficult. The thing that I try to tell people that I work with is don't do it on a whole feedlot. Work with them on 1 or 2 pens in a feedlot. Let people adapt to this gradually. And when they adapt to it and they see that on the days after a storm has come through, that there are pens of cattle that they're controlling the intake, there's not a lot of feed to weigh back. It's actually less labor And if you get people to follow an entire pen of cattle through to finish, they'll find out that they actually consumed as much or more than the similar pens of cattle that had feed in the bunk all the time. But more importantly, the gain that they put on was a more efficient gain. And so it takes less kilograms of feed per kilogram of gain.
Okay, Francis, thank you very much for this short interview, but is your first time here in Argentina?
No, this is my 8th time in Argentina. This is kind of like a second home to me now.
You have received a lot of questions from Argentinian vets. What do you think about the questions or their situation here in our feedlots?
I actually think that the training for veterinarians in Argentina is probably as or more difficult than every other place in the world that I've been. And the questions I get here are at a much higher technical level than I get other places. You're in good hands.
Thank you very much. Bien, y nosotros seguimos transmitiendo en esto que es el tercer encuentro anual para veterinarios que organiza la Cámara Argentina de Feedlot.